Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. We tend not to speak to a lot of politicians here on Fear and Greed, but every now and then we make an exception. We're probably 6 months out from a federal election, and unlike any in recent history, it'll be a poll contested over the government's handling of a pandemic, both the health and the economic impact. But it's also going to be a battle over climate policy, our changing place in the world, and of course, the economy. Labor frontbencher Tanya Plibersek is a Shadow Minister for Education and Shadow Minister for Women. Tanya, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Now, I know Labor doesn't call the election, but when do you reckon it'll be?
Look, I wasn't ruling out December, but I think as we get closer to those potential dates, the 4th or the 11th of December, it's looking less and less likely. I think it's most likely to be around March next year.
Okay, now elections are often defined by a really big issue, and sometimes we don't realise that issue until afterwards. In hindsight, we look back and think that was the defining moment. Do you have a view, whenever the election is, and let's say it's March next year or thereabouts, what the big issue will be?
I think the government's handling of the pandemic will still be important, but people will also be looking forward to how the government's going to rebuild the economy coming out of the lockdowns. And that means a real focus on job security, productivity, employment in caring sectors. And it also means, how we're going with climate change and decarbonising the economy.
Okay, if you take a few of those, how do you think the government has performed economic-wise during the pandemic? Because in actual fact, we're in a pretty good position as we stand here today.
I think Australia as a nation has done very well, and people have been prepared to look after each other, sacrifice for each other. A lot of people have lost jobs or hours of work. There's been a great deal of insecurity. And I think the fact that our vaccination rates have gone well, that's a real tribute to Australians. Our hospital system has coped well. It's a real tribute to Medicare. I would say I think the government's very slow initial rollout of vaccines and the bloody-minded refusal to get involved in the quarantine system from the federal level, I think they were real handbrakes on how we dealt with the pandemic. It's pretty plain that the second big lockdowns in New South Wales and Victoria probably could have been shorter or avoided altogether if we'd got vaccines and quarantine right in the first place. I also think a lot of small businesses and employers and employees in the sort of, I guess you'd call newer sectors of the economy or less regulated sectors of the economy have really struggled. So I represent the federal seat of Sydney. If you look at what has happened to hospitality, entertainment, people like food delivery riders, they have really struggled. And I guess that is galling for those people when they see overpayments in JobKeeper, billions of dollars going to companies that actually saw their profits increase. If you're a small business and you don't fit the exact criteria of government supports and you've missed out for some reason, and you look at companies that have had really strong growth during lockdown still benefiting from government support, I think that's tough. And like I say, sectors like live music, entertainment, they are huge employers in my electorate, and that workforce is, because they're not regularly employed, has really struggled to get assistance. So there's bright spots and there's areas that we definitely could have done better.
Okay, let's move on to climate change. Now, the Coalition has finally confirmed its climate policy. The Prime Minister's at COP26 at the moment.
If you could call it that, Sean.
Well, we don't quite have the roadmap, but we've got the words that go around it. Shall we say that? Net zero by 2050. What's Labor's policy?
Well, we'll be making more detailed policy announcements in coming weeks, but we have had a commitment to net zero by 2050 for some time, and we've laid out a whole lot of practical measures that would help us achieve that, like investing in our transmission lines. We know that we need to upgrade transmission to cope with the new renewables that are coming into the grid, like investing in electric vehicles, making it cheaper for people who want to buy an electric vehicle to get that electric vehicle, like making sure that we've got the workforce, the renewables workforce, by investing in apprenticeships for people who are going into that sector. We'll have more to say about our medium-term targets in coming weeks and more to say about how we achieve them. I think it's really worth noting that every state and territory signed up to net zero by 2050, but the really big change that has happened in Australia in recent years, all of our major businesses, National Farmers Federation, Meat and Livestock Corporation, all of them have been a step ahead of our federal government. And I think that's really important. It shows that, this is not just an issue for greenies. This is a really mainstream issue now. There is a reason that 1 in 4 Australian households has solar panels on the roof. They have worked out that you get cheaper electricity from solar power, and we can power our economy and the jobs that come with it by investing in renewables and making use of them to get down bills in households, but also to get down electricity bills for businesses. We know that we can be a manufacturer again. Think about the huge cost of electricity for big businesses like retail, the power of bringing down those electricity prices to drive our economy is enormous.
Okay, I take all that, but notwithstanding you will provide more details in coming weeks, it's still a technology-style solution as opposed to pricing carbon. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think pricing carbon was the right policy at the beginning of this change process, which is now, a decade and a half ago or more. Yep. But in fact, we know that solar electricity is the cheapest form of electricity in human history. Like, that price signal is not needed anymore. What we need is a framework that allows those renewables to get pumped into the grid and distributed to the homes and businesses they need them in the most effective way. And Australia just can be a world leader in this. The real frustration of the government not signing up to zero net emissions by 2050 or more ambitious medium-term targets is that it's a handbrake on our competitiveness in the world. Like, seriously, if we get green hydrogen right, if we can be manufacturing green steel, green aluminium, green cement, use green hydrogen for those really energy-intensive industries like fertiliser manufacture, there will be demand for those products from the EU, from the US, from countries that have signed up to more ambitious targets than us. We could be meeting that niche. We could be growing Australian jobs. And it is really frustrating that the Conservatives keep portraying this as a cost, a sacrifice, when it is such an opportunity if we can just grasp it.
Stay with me, Tanya. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Labor frontbencher Tanya Plibersek. Okay, let's move on to tax policy. The last election, your tax policy didn't do you any favours. Amendments to negative gearing, franking credits, capital gains tax. Now, it appears that you have dropped most of those issues or most of those suggestions since then. Do you think you'll come out with a raft of different tax policy or changes in tax policy in the lead up to the next election?
Well, we have dropped those policies, and our support for stage 3 of the government's tax cuts is clear and on the record. We will be, we'll have further things to say about how we design our tax policy in coming months as well. But at the heart of the way we make our decisions will always be what's fair. How do we make sure that people on the lowest incomes benefit from the services they need and pay the lowest amount of tax that they need to for us to live in a civilised community? We also need to make sure, this will always be a focus for Labor, that people are paying what they should be, that people and companies, particularly at the upper end, we know that we continue to have a problem, for example, with large multinational companies using tax minimisation arrangements, routing their profits through other countries and so on. And I think it's really important that we continue to work with the global community to reduce opportunities for that sort of, deliberate policy to reduce the amount of tax that some of our big multinational companies pay in Australia.
And getting onto your area specifically, how do we kickstart the education sector in Australia, particularly the tertiary education system, given the lack of international students? And even if we open the borders, it will take time to get things going. Media reports suggest that Canada has really taken a lot of Australian students, and then this all flows back down through to high schools and primary schools. It really is a sector that's struggling.
Education has been incredibly hard hit during the pandemic, and particularly, as you say, universities. We've got a sector that is the largest, or was before the pandemic, the largest services export that Australia has. It's the fourth largest export in dollar terms that Australia has. Out of 200,000 staff, round about 200,000 staff employed in the sector, 40,000 have lost their jobs. I think if any other sector had been as hard hit as this, the government would have been there with assistance. Instead, they changed the JobKeeper arrangements 3 times to deliberately exclude our public universities from being able to receive JobKeeper. Now, those 40,000 jobs are all over the country. So you take, for example, 300 jobs out of Rockhampton, that has a big impact on regional communities that this government is in complete denial about. But the effect of those job losses isn't just a problem for the students that miss out on the teaching that those people would provide. It's also a problem for our future productivity. We have lost 7,000 researchers. Where are we going to get the discoveries, the innovations, the inventions that will be the products and the companies and the employers of Australians in the future? When we take that sort of brain power out of our economy, that has a decades-long impact. So we've got a real problem with many more students applying for a university place than there's room for. So we've got increasing numbers of students being turned away. We've got thousands of students for whom the cost of a degree has doubled under this government. We've got the brain drain with the job losses. We need to turn this around for Australia to be a rich and successful and productive country. We want wages to go up. We want wages to go up because Australians are more productive at work, and the university role in that is absolutely critical. We see the same in schools and childcare. We need to invest for the future. We know that $1 spent when a child is 3 years old or 4 years old can have a lifelong impact for that child.
Okay, moving out of policy, one thing about the pandemic which I've really enjoyed is the fact, the bipartisanship really out of Canberra around the health needs primarily. Now, as it went on, the states and Canberra perhaps didn't agree quite as much, but I think both the Coalition and Labor worked really well together, and it showed the benefits of that. I think some of the foreign relations things, perhaps not Emmanuel Macron and Scott Morrison's recent discussions together, but generally, Labor and the Coalition have worked reasonably well. Don't you think people really like that bipartisanship with really big picture issues like defence, like the pandemic? Don't you think Australians like the fact that politicians negotiate and work together to a common outcome?
I think you're dead right. I think it's the only way forward on large and complex issues. Certainly during a time like the pandemic, there's no way that Labor would have just been difficult and obstructionist because lives are at stake.
Yep.
It's responsible to try and cooperate and help the government in any way we can during a time like that. It's like the Second World War. A nation comes together to have a common goal. I think it is still important that if the government's getting something wrong, people sensibly and responsibly raise those issues. And I think the slow vaccine rollout is a really good example of that. We could have done better as a nation if we'd had more deals earlier to get more jabs in more people's arms.
Okay. And finally, Tanya, how do you do it? Who does the washing at your place? Now, your partner has a very big job. You obviously have an extremely high-profile big job. You've got kids. Who does do the washing?
Mostly me. Mostly
How
me.
do you manage it?
But I'll tell you this, when I walk out the door, if I'm going to Canberra, I don't have to leave my husband a set of instructions. He is such a fantastic parent and such a supportive partner. We do things together. We work out who needs to do what. People often ask this question. The truth is we're luckier than most, and the people I really worry about in Australia today are not busy people with well-paid jobs, but people in insecure employment, people who are delivery riders working for $10 an hour or picking blueberries for $3 an hour who don't know where their next paycheck's coming from. They're the ones I ask, how are they doing it?
I think that's a fair comment, but I still admire the fact that, and you do have kids and all that, it's a huge responsibility. For example, I think there'd be more women in corporate Australia and politics if we actually made it easier for all people, men and women, to partake in those particular roles and places and things like that.
Well, women would be better paid and have better career paths if men did more at home in general.
Yeah,
that is absolutely for sure. And I think the best way to manage is just to bite off more than you can chew and chew furiously. Isn't what's that expression?
You've done well then.
I don't know if I'd had any sense when I was first signing up for this wild ride, perhaps I wouldn't have done it. But
fair enough.
Just dive in. Just dive in is my advice.
Tanya, thank you very much for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean.
That was Labor frontbencher Tanya Plibersek. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.